Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. I'm extremely honored and happy to welcome on this podcast from the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, the European precursor to European Advanced Research Project Agency, a European ARPA, member of the European Parliament, Dragos Tudorache. Dear Dragos, it's very nice to have you here.
Very happy to be with you.
We are very eager when
sorry for this background behind me. All of a sudden in Strasbourg it's very sunny, so there's a lot of
that's wonderful.
There's nothing I can do about it.
We hope it's a symbol of the rise of Europe as technological power. I think we need this. When we prepared this session with you, which we wanted to have really in the very next days after the conclusion of the trilogue on the EU AI Act, we received a lot of feedback from our community, made of scientists, deep tech founders, and industrialists. My goodness, what have we done with the AI Act? I mean, there was a little bit of a backlash. So people are very eager to listen to you and to know a little bit more what exactly has been reached as an agreement. So please.
Well, it's a very complex text, so I don't know exactly where to go with the presentation because I don't know what the interest of your community is. I would dare to guess that it's mostly on what we've done with the foundation models and the whole regulation of the business part of the text, not necessarily on issues related to biometrics and the whole security or law enforcement, which has actually made up quite a lot of debate time last week. So I'll give a very brief outline, and then if there are concrete questions, probably it's best that we do that. So what is it in the final text that I think balances out and responds to many of the legitimate questions that I had heard prior to the negotiations coming from the industry? So first and foremost, let's clarify one thing. Research, development, testing, anything that happens before a product goes on the market is outside the scope of this regulation. Full stop. There's no nuance to it. There's no question about it. It has never been, by the way. There was a misunderstanding at some point because there were actually even some governmental positions that were built on the assumption that somehow we want to regulate also R&D. No, we never wanted to. Again, if anyone thought that we wanted to, it was a misunderstanding. And in order to make it even clearer, we have actually strengthened the exception that already existed in the text since probably more than a year ago. And we actually wrote even clearer in the article related to scope that research, testing, development, so all work prior to going on the market is outside the scope. So I think that's an important point to make at the beginning. The second point that I think it's important to make at the beginning, open source, because again, there was a lot of discussion about what treatment do we give to open source. So open source that happens outside the high risk area is again exempt. Open source for foundation models in the lower tier is exempt. Open source in the top tier is covered by the regulation just as proprietary AI. So again, just to also clarify what is the regime for open source. Now on foundation models. So first of all, we're speaking of models, not systems. So systems, general purpose systems that are built on models, they are treated just like systems, applications. If they're high risk, they're high risk. If they are not, they're not. We're not covering them in here. So systems are out of the scope of the special regime that we crafted for models. Now, what we did for models. We've introduced this threshold. So you could call that there are two tiers. Not many like the concept of two tiers. We can call it whatever. But the idea is that there is a threshold, which we have set at 10 to 25, sorry. So there was a debate between 10 to 24, which is how we entered in the negotiations as Parliament. Council, which entered with 1026, we ended with 1025. Based on what I know, on what we know, as part of the discussions, there is only one application right now, one model, in fact, which is a 1025, which is the Google Gemini. Again, I don't know whether there are any other who are preparing to break the barrier soon, but this is where the barrier is, which means what? Anyone that is below 10 to 25 is in the lower tier model. Anyone that is above is in the top tier model. Also, there is flexibility to how this threshold will evolve in time, because we realize that this is something that might be less relevant in 6 months' time, or in 1 year time, or in 2 years' time, or more, because either the compute is going to decrease, so you can actually achieve the same capabilities that you right now have with 1025 with lower.
Just maybe one precision. I mean, our audience is very technical, but it's the computing power. So 10
flops, yeah.
factor 25 computation per second, and going from 1024 to 1025 is an order of magnitude. So it's 10 times.
Absolutely.
Just
Absolutely.
to make it clear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I work on the assumption that, again, I'm talking to people who know better than I do.
No.
Again, that's where the threshold is. There is also in an annex a list of other criteria that the future regulator might use to make their determination. But all that, again, is subject to flexibility, to adaptability. There is a mandate that we're giving in the text to the future regulator and the Commission to adapt this criteria, to adapt this threshold, if needed, in consultation with the future scientific board, which the office will have. So we are introducing a scientific board next to the advisory board, which also regroups the industry, all stakeholders, the researchers, the civil society. So all the communities that have a say in the matter will be part of the advisory group. Plus, there will be a scientific board made up of real researchers, scientists who can bring value to the conversation and to the judgments that the future office will make. So all these adaptations that will be done based on constant feedback, discussions in the scientific board, in the advisory group, so that, again, that reality check that I always talk about can happen in real time and can feed into the decisions that the future regulator will take. So now coming back to what happens below the threshold and above the threshold. So below the threshold, for, let's say, the low tier models, we have tried to simplify the obligations as much as we could, so that we stay with what we consider to be a minimum level of transparency in terms of documentation to be made available, in terms of data used for training, and one point which I know has created a lot of debate, the copyrighted material, the summary of copyrighted material used in training. So these are the things which are applicable to the lower tier model. And there is also an annex which specifies in terms of what documentation, what kind of data needs to be made part of this, let's say, transparency exercise. But those annexes are still being fine-tuned, refined, simplified by our colleagues at technical level. We have given them a mandate to continue to do that in the coming days. Above the threshold, there's a blend of self-regulation and hard obligations. Why? Because on one hand, we thought it is important to have very clear the obligations which are applicable, even to the top tier model. And here we are adding on the transparency elements for the lower tier, we are adding things like testing and red teaming, adversarial testing and red teaming, basically, a criteria related to energy efficiency once standards for that would be available. So we realize that there are no standards for measuring energy efficiency, but we say once those would be available, that companies that are above that threshold will also have to be transparent about how they have featured energy efficiency into the development of their algorithm. Risk mitigation measures and incident reporting mechanisms. So these are the added responsibilities for the top tier model, and recognizing that there are no measurements yet, there are no standards yet as to how a company can actually fulfill those obligations. We have allowed for the introduction of this, what we call the code of practice, or codes of practice, which is basically a way for the industry themselves to write in these codes of practice how they develop a methodology for fulfilling those obligations. And those code of practice would then be sent to the future regulator, to the Commission, in fact, who then could also adopt implementing acts to fix those codes of practice. And they will be the measuring tool and the assumption of conformity. So there is an assumption of conformity once you have declared your adherence to a code of practice. And that will be the measuring tool until standards will be developed. So we're saying that this, let's say, framework, this architecture with the codes of practice is something of an interim nature until standards will be developed as to how those obligations could be measured and
if I can interrupt you
yes,
here,
please.
Dragos, how close is this part to the approach the White House and the US has taken? It seems to be pretty similar in the guidance aspect and the self.
It is. So it is basically a recognition of the fact that above that threshold, and to address those structural risks that might occur, because it's not mandatory that companies automatically above the threshold. And by the way, we're not creating that automaticity. So no, we're not saying that, well, if you're above there, automatically there are risks that might come up. No, but in a code generation, in a code generative process, basically, between the companies and the regulator, which is very similar to the US approach in the executive order, using these codes of practice, first of all, at the moment when you elaborate them, but also at the moment when you play with them, you implement them, you follow them, you monitor them, that there is in fact a cooperative process rather than a police to the villain process. That's very important to note. There are no villains in the logic of this text, and no police officer. It's just the regulator and the companies that together are creating the codes of practice, are creating the measuring tools for what is, and we recognize that a very new, fluid, constantly evolving technology where we need to be very flexible in how we address compliance, and therefore we need to do it together with those that are developing it. So that's, in a nutshell, the brief description of what we've done. Of course, there's a lot of detail still in the text, also in annexes. As I said, those are being cleaned up right now. So there will be a bit of time before you see the final text. I hope a matter of days, not more. But that is work in progress.
No, thank you very much to have explained that. A couple of hard questions, because they are obviously the ones who pop up the most. We will talk about the signal effect, because I think it's absolutely critical that you also get the communication right, because when the perception is, but we'll talk about it, that it hampers innovation, obviously it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But let's go back to the technicalities. Number one is you started yourself the discussion saying it's a complex text. And we all know from previous EU regulation that sometimes you can have very well-intended texts, but because of the complexity, they kind of privilege the larger players, and they are not necessarily neither European nor the most innovative. How is this adapted to actually a sector which is just emerging? Especially in Europe. That's question number one. And question number two is, how do you make the real difference in a world where increasingly fundamental and applied research is coming together? How do you make the clear distinction between what you said, the threshold that's not applied to the research part, and the part which is really use cases and applications within organizations? If you could just elaborate on these two points.
Well, on the first point with, let's say, the small players. Well, if you're a small player, first of all, you're not part of the conversation, because let's say you're a small player and this is where, at least as far as I know, most of our market is right now, you are developing a system or an application on the basis of an existing model. That's where most of our startups are. They take existing models, bits and pieces of that, and then they build themselves on top of it various other applications that are either going to be in high risk categories or not at all. And depending on that, they will only have to do those things. So they don't have to worry about all of that. On the contrary, we are helping them by forcing the providers of the bigger models to pass on important documentation that they would need, the ones down the stream would need to then make their own compliance. So again, in our minds, and I hope we are responding to a genuine and legitimate expectation from those smaller players, we are giving them the tools to achieve compliance easier, because right now, if they want to knock on the door of a bigger company, like one of the big tech companies that is putting some of these big models on the table, they may not be that successful in achieving what they want. Right now, we are putting that obligation in the text, so that is helping them. Second, the whole construction of the AI Act is made to help the smaller companies. Everything from the fact that we work with self-assessment and not third-party assessment, the fact that we are creating exceptions for SMEs to simplify some of the obligations that are in the text when they apply to SMEs. The sandboxes, which are also meant to help those that are, okay, I'm a small company, I've done my self-assessment, I'm still uncertain as to what I have to do. I still have the option. I go to a sandbox, I sit down with the regulator, I go through my assumptions, I go through my data, I go through the testing that I've done, and then I know, okay, I'm there or not. If you are under the threshold for high risk, for example, the only thing you need to do is to go and put yourself in the registry. That's it. You don't have to do anything else. All the rest of the burden is on the regulator if they want to go check whatever later on. So a lot of the provisions in the text are already built to help smaller companies in leveling up the playing field towards the bigger ones. Because yes, we are very much aware of the fact that it is very easy for big companies to do compliance. All they need to do is hire a bit more lawyers or compliance officers, and they do it. The real pressure is on the companies that have 10, 5, 10, 20, 30 employees and can't afford to do too much red tape. And that's the last thing that we want. Again, I underline this 5 times. The last thing we want is that we put too much burden on them. But on the other hand, and I think it is also speaking for those companies that want to make sure that what they put on the market is trustworthy, and that ultimately the customers, the users, are interacting with those tools with trust, confidence, rather than with fear or risk of bias, prejudice, or anything else that the society might fear right now about AI. So again, it is a two-way street. It's something that is also meant to help companies in telling their public, telling their audience, listen, take this product, it is conform, it is something that respects your interests, your values, and therefore don't fear it. And uptake is something that I think any company that works in this area should be interested in. So that's at least how I see this part. And then as far as the models are concerned, anyone that is below 10 to 25 is small in a way. And I would say, at least right now, that's the entire European market. No one is above 10 to 25 right now. So,
but how do we make sure that we are big propenders of the next big thing? I mean, we think it makes zero sense in most of the technologies to run after the existing players, but there is this gigantic opportunity to leapfrog. So leapfrogging will probably come from this energy efficiency. I think that is a very, very interesting, the frugal AI concept, but probably also by much larger models. How do we make sure that these models, these teams, these AI researchers still get attracted by doing it in Europe?
Well, but also let's look at those obligations that we put for the top tier. So let's say that I am a company that aspires to be above the threshold, right? So I'm not content to just being one of those others, 99% that are under the tier. I want to be the 1%. I say, great, do it. And if you get above the clouds, if you get at that level, then I also ask myself the question, once you got to that level, Is it that difficult to actually have an incident reporting mechanism in place? And is it that bad, or is it stifling innovation if you do that? Is it that problematic if you have to show that you have done adversarial testing? I would say it's a minimum level of responsibility that you should exercise once you set as an objective to be there in the top 1%. Because what does that mean? It means that your application, your model is going to be used and replicated in myriads of applications out there. Well, there's quite a responsibility. If you have a hallucination in your model, well, that has a consequence. So again, anyone that comes and tells me, listen, the Wild West is great and we just want no rules, we're not there. And I'm sorry to say, our society is not there. So I think that companies owe that bit of accountability, that bit of diligence and responsibility. If they want to be up there, it's great that they want to be up there, but that comes with some responsibility when you're big. And that responsibility is translated into these, I consider still to be minimal obligations with a framework that is very flexible, that is code-generated, codes of practice, where you can actually determine quite a lot of how it is that you're going to be measured and how you fulfill obligations.
I mean, the responsibility, Dragos, and with your policy colleagues, is huge on your shoulders. Because let's face it, in the past, EU regulation has not, I would say, a track record of making simple regulation. And I give you just the anecdote. I won't name who it is, but I asked the rapporteur, your colleague, who is the rapporteur for the Net Zero Industry Act, and it was very difficult even for him to explain to me, which is the response to the US Inflation Reduction Act, to explain the simplicity. So I think the responsibility to kind of show that EU regulation can be as simple as the US IRA, I think is critical, not only to avoid stifling innovation, but also to ensure that you will be able to quickly update it. Because if it's too complicated, you will have a hard time to reopen the box. How can you make us comfortable that this is the case, Dragos?
Well, I would like to say, but clearly I'm subjective, that we have done our utmost, because this was been from day one an objective of ours, that we make this regulation somewhat different than some of the mistakes done in the past with some previous legislation, which has proven indeed, and I would be the first one to say it, has proven too cumbersome for companies to navigate. And it has created huge barriers for innovation and for growth for many companies in Europe. And again, I'm the first one to say that. Starts with the GDPR and many others. And in many other sectors, by the way, not only in digital.
Thank you for addressing something which is a little bit of holy cow in Brussels, but indeed
not for me.
Great.
Not for me. When there's a mistake, I think we have to have the courage to admit it. So at first, again, we've tried with this regulation to do things differently, but I won't have the audacity to say that we've managed it all, and that this is going to be perfect regulation, super simple for everyone to understand and play with. It may be that some parts of it might prove to be complicated. But that is why we have, and this is why I also insisted from day one, this has been one of my key objectives throughout these negotiations, to have a governance that is open, and open to the ones that matter, and that know the business the best, which is the industry dealing with it. I know that, again, it has been a holy cow for us in the EU. We somehow have always been afraid to touch or to work with industry. We've always seen it as lobby that is coming to influence us. I think that this is where we have to learn from the Americans. I'm always saying publicly, if there is one thing that we need to learn in the way we build our model of governance and pushing it also towards the American model, just as they will have to push their model a bit towards our model, because they can no longer do just what they've done up to now. And I think they realize that. So in doing a governance that, again, makes sense, that keeps the operators at the table. So for me, the future governance, the future market regulator and the Commission, the future AI office and the Commission, They will be, again, sitting day in, day out with the people that can bring that reality check to them all the time. And wherever and whenever they will see that there needs to be some adaptation to the text. They have the mandates throughout the text where the text is not technology neutral, where we have technical criteria or technical description. So anything that depends also on how the implementation will play out and how the technology will evolve, that's where there is a mandate for adaptation and flexibility. And that mandate will have to be exercised to make sure that this regulation stays alive and stays as close as possible to the needs of those developing and deploying these algorithms.
We set ourselves a fixed time. If you still have just a couple of minutes with us,
only a couple, because I need to go and vote.
Absolutely. So that's important. OpenAI, the OpenAI drama. What did it change in the process? What did you learn out of that, or what is your takeaway? And secondly, maybe how do we ensure altogether that the signal we're addressing to the innovation community is a positive one? You talked about lobbying. I think also for all those who are listening to us, I think it's also important that the European players understand the word pushing and advocacy in the right term. I saw a lot of players lobbying for their own little short-term interest, and I think that is not helping the cause. But OpenAI, and what does success look like for the AI Act, Dragos? And we'll finish on that.
Well, at least I don't know. I don't know if there are people who know much more. I only know what I read in the press, and it's not very clear why the initial breakdown happened, and also how was it that it was mended a few days later, and what was the role of Microsoft in this or not, and so on and so forth. So, and I don't usually like to work on speculation, so I won't speculate as to the reasons why it happened, but it did show one thing. You asked me what is my takeaway. My takeaway is that indeed there needs to be some responsibility, because again, when these big companies, if they catch a cold, it's like with the German economy in the EU. When the German economy catches a cold, everyone is sneezing. And it's a bit the same thing. Again, when one of these very powerful companies that does have such a powerful impact on the whole market, if there is a problem in paradise up there, well, if you have no accountability, no responsibility, no set of norms, hard norms, that forces some transparency, some diligence in the way these things are happening in these companies, then again, you are literally in a Wild West where the mighty impose their norm and they do whatever they want, free of charge. And again, that's not a world, that's not an industry, that's not an economy, a digital economy, where I think that we would have an interest to continue to play. It's been like that for quite some time, and I don't think it helped out. It forced us to be reactive on many things, and look where we are today. Look where our societies are right now, because we've allowed social media to do whatever it wanted with the minds of our citizens. Now we're trying to catch up, but it's to a large extent quite late. So again, I think some sense of discipline and responsibility in the market when it comes to how we now let play AI unravel is key. And second, how does success look like? Well, for me, success is going to be measured rather quickly after coming into force, depending on how we see the interaction between, again, regulator and industry, how we see the industry in incorporating the new obligations, how they understand the mechanisms, how they quickly realize if they're out of the scope and they continue to do business unhindered, or if they're in the scope, how they adapt their internal mechanisms to do well. And as I always say, I think the key of success will be in how the market regulators at national level and European level understand their mission. If they understand their mission just by taking a stick and hitting everyone in the head with it, then it's a very, very bad understanding of what the scope of this regulation is. There needs to be flexibility, understanding it to be people who are able to speak to people who create, who develop, who grow this industry, and speak the same language to know exactly where to put the cursor in the implementation and enforcement. So if that happens, then this is going to be success. If it doesn't happen, then we'll have to get back to the drawing board, be prepared to do that, and make adaptations to make sure that that happens.
We will definitely invite you regularly, and you can count on us both to give you a sense of the strategic thinking, at least from our perspective, but also to help create the mighty, because if we don't have the mighty in Europe, obviously others will the world for us. So on that one, JEDI will be engaged. Dragos Tudorache, thank you so much for your time and for your commitment and for your energy.
Thank you. Bye.